She turned her weakness into the most powerful weapon against the unfair world of family and corporate life. The voice was sharp, bored, and practiced. Marjorie Hale from Internal Relations didn't even look up from her phone as she said it. The case was pale gold, polished to a shine that reflected the ceiling lights better than her expression ever reflected empathy. The last cleaner didn't last long, she added. Details matter. I adjusted the sleeves of my plain navy uniform and pushed the cart forward, its wheels whispering against the carpeted hallway. In the side pocket of my shoulder bag rested 2 documents no one here knew about, a framed appointment letter naming me the next chief executive officer of North Star Consolidated, and a graduate diploma from an institution people like Marjorie loved to drop into conversations, when it suited them. Yes, ma'am, I replied quietly. My name, for now, was Lena Cross. Evening custodial staff. Temporary contract. Replaceable. It had been 14 days since I started this assignment, my own idea, not the board's. They wanted discretion, a quiet evaluation period before the official transition. They didn't say how I should observe. I chose invisibility. By the end of week 1, I had already filled 2 notebooks. As I passed the accounting wing, raised voices echoed through the half-open glass doors. This is basic, snapped a man in a tailored gray suit, Evan Rourke, senior accounting manager. If you can't keep up, you don't belong here. A younger employee stood rigidly across from him, eyes fixed on the floor. Their hands trembled slightly. I slowed my steps, pretending to wipe fingerprints from the glass while recording a mental note. Public humiliation. Pattern behavior. Power used as theater. North Star's lower floors told one story: flickering lights, aging chairs, compressed air that smelled faintly of burnt dust. The executive level told another. Up here, the lighting softened. The art was original. The carpet absorbed sound the way money absorbs consequence. Hey! Cleaner. The voice came from an open corner office. Caleb Whitman, regional vice president. Watch the shelf, he said without looking at me. Those awards cost more than your annual salary. I nodded and dusted carefully. The trophies were decorative, networking banquets, charity golf tournaments. None related to actual performance. Don't touch anything on the desk, he added. Confidential material. I already knew what the papers were. I'd reviewed them with the board before this assignment even began. Expansion models that would look brilliant for 2 quarters and collapse an entire division by the 3rd. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. Board chair, tomorrow still confirmed. Introduction at 10 o'clock. Me, everything is ready. A woman's heels clicked sharply behind me. There's a stain in Conference A, said Nora Beck, Director of Brand Strategy. If that room isn't perfect for tomorrow, you won't be coming back. Her tone wasn't angry. It was dismissive. As if the threat barely required breath. I'll take care of it, I said. Conference A was silent and immaculate when I arrived. I wiped the long table slowly, deliberately, my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. Tomorrow, I would sit at the head of it. Outside the room, voices drifted through the hall. Heard the new chief is a numbers fanatic, someone said. Doesn't matter, Caleb replied. They never last if they push too hard. Marjorie laughed softly. This company doesn't change. People just rotate. I finished my work and logged the final note of the evening. Systemic arrogance. Culture preserved through intimidation. Leadership insulated from consequence. At 9:12 p.m. Finance Director Roland Pierce passed me, speaking harshly into his phone. I don't care how you adjust it. Make the projection cleaner before morning. And get maintenance out of my way. I stepped aside, invisible again. That night, at home, my suit hung pressed and ready. My badge lay on the table, face down. Tomorrow, the invisible floor would disappear. The morning arrived sharp and bright, the kind of day that exposes everything in white light. I arrived early, still in the uniform, rolling my cart quietly down the main hallway. Executives were rushing, papers in hand, rehearsing lines they thought would impress a stranger. No one noticed me. Marjorie Hale appeared, her heels clattering like tiny judgment hammers. What are you still doing here? She asked, eyebrows drawn tight. All cleaning staff must clear out before the new CEO arrives. Visibility matters. Yes, ma'am, I replied softly, making a deliberate show of gathering supplies. Just finishing Conference A. She didn't linger. I allowed a small, private smile. Through the glass walls, I watched Caleb Whitman adjusting his tie, practicing a speech he would never deliver. Fresh perspective is dangerous, he muttered, not knowing the observer was inches away, invisible and noting every word. By 9:45 a.m., the executives had gathered. The conference room buzzed like electricity stored under glass. Anxiety, ambition, fear, all flavors concentrated in tailored suits and designer dresses. They didn't see me as anything other than a shadow. I excused myself to the executive bathroom. 12 minutes later, the transformation was complete. Gone was Lena Cross, the invisible cleaner. In her place stood Lena Whitfield, Harvard MBA, former CEO of an industry tech firm, and now, official chief executive officer of Northstar Consolidated. My hair was polished, my suit pressed, my badge gleaming. I returned to the room as the board chairman's voice resonated. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your new chief executive officer." The doors opened, and I walked in, heels clicking deliberately against the polished marble floor. The room froze. Marjorie's coffee cup slipped, spilling on her cream suit. Caleb's rehearsed confidence faltered mid-thought. Nora Beck maintained her posture but not her composure, the slight crack in her facade betrayed disbelief. I approached the head of the table and placed my badge in front of me. "Good morning," I said, calm and precise. "I am Lena Whitfield. For the past 2 weeks, you have known me as Lena, the cleaning staff. I have spent that time observing this company from the ground up." Faces turned pale. "I have seen your culture," I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the room. "I have observed the hierarchy, the arrogance, the favoritism, and the fear. Today, we discuss what I have learned." Marjorie's face lost all color. "Impossible," she whispered. "I'm Lena Whitfield, CEO in waiting," I stated, voice steady. "Former CEO. Harvard graduate. And for 2 weeks, I have been invisible to you all." I connected my laptop to the display. Slide 1 illuminated the room, meticulous documentation of every condescending comment, every violation of professional ethics, every subtle abuse of power. Names, dates, recordings, screenshots, all unassailable evidence. I turned slowly to Caleb Whitman. "Your confidential files on merger proposals? Already reviewed and rejected by me last week. Risky acquisitions that would bankrupt 3 subsidiaries? Not happening." He shifted in his chair, lips tight, unable to construct a lie. I glanced at Nora Beck. "Your threats about job security, the intimidation campaigns? Logged. Filed. Evaluated." The board chairman, sitting silently, allowed a rare smile to emerge. He had insisted on discretion, knowing my approach was unconventional. The room trembled under my calm authority. "I will now outline the immediate changes," I said, standing to face them fully. "Marjorie Hale, you are relieved of your HR responsibilities. Your replacement is Janet Lynn, formerly part of our custodial staff, a master's-trained HR specialist who has been systematically overlooked. Caleb Whitman, your vice president role is eliminated. Your duties will be divided among junior analysts, the very people you've undermined for years." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Nora Beck, realizing her carefully built aura of power was about to crumble, began shaking, but I didn't pause. "Every executive who has displayed abusive behavior during my observation period will spend 1 month in entry-level positions. Consider this a learning experience. Promotions will now be merit-based. Salaries will be adjusted for fairness. The executive floor? Converted to a shared workspace. No one above anyone else." A ripple of whispered excitement went through the employees who had been ignored and mistreated for years. Some dared a tentative smile. I clicked to the next slide, video clips, screenshots, detailed accounts of misconduct. Visual proof, undeniable and direct. No excuses would hold. Finally, I looked at the room, steady and unwavering. "My cleaning cart remains in my office," I said, allowing the words to land softly. Not as a symbol of these 2 weeks, but as a reminder, no role, no contribution, no person is beneath respect. The hierarchy here ends today. The room was silent. Some in stunned disbelief, others in dawning comprehension. I paused, letting the moment stretch. The lower-level staff in the back leaned forward, emboldened. A few even whispered quietly, awestruck. This was no longer Lena the Invisible. This was Lena the Reckoning. The following days unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos and revelation. The executives who had underestimated me were now scrambling, each one trying desperately to adapt to a reality they had refused to see. Marjorie Hale, once so condescending, now hovered around the office in a nervous blur, her carefully constructed confidence shattered. Every email she sent to me, once dripping with superiority, was now tentative, almost pleading. I forwarded one particularly absurd apology to Janet Lin, our new HR director. "Please see how humility can manifest when the hierarchy is corrected," I wrote. Her laughter behind the screen was one of quiet satisfaction. The shift in energy among the staff was palpable. People who had been invisible for years suddenly had voices. They spoke, they suggested, they corrected. The atmosphere was no longer one of fear, but one of cautious empowerment. Caleb Whitman, the former vice president, was struggling the most. Reduced to mentoring a team of junior analysts he had once dismissed as incompetent, he now faced their questions, their expectations, and their scrutiny. No longer could he hide behind arrogance or authority. Every misstep was documented, every attempt at intimidation backfired. I watched him from my office window, a once untouchable figure reduced to vulnerability and frustration. Nora Beck, formerly head of marketing, was reassigned to client relations. She now directly interacted with the very people she had sought to manipulate and belittle. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. The brilliant facade of superiority cracked under the weight of real responsibility. I smiled quietly to myself. True change isn't instantaneous, it is cultivated, nurtured, and enforced. One afternoon, as I reviewed reports in my office, my phone buzzed. A message from the board chairman simply read, "The transformation is beyond what we hoped." "Well done, Lena." I allowed myself a small smile. This was the culmination of weeks of careful observation, strategic patience, and meticulous documentation. It wasn't just about power, it was about justice. Meanwhile, the employees began to rally around the changes. Teams that had been pitted against each other now collaborated. Ideas once ignored were implemented. Productivity soared. The company was becoming more than a profit machine, it was becoming a place where talent was recognized and rewarded, where hard work mattered more than status. But not everyone welcomed this shift. Small acts of resistance surfaced, as they always do. There were whispered complaints, subtle attempts to undermine authority, and the occasional outright defiance. Each of these incidents was handled methodically. Evidence was collected, warnings issued, and accountability enforced. No one could claim ignorance, no one could feign innocence. The rules were clear, and the precedent had been set. Then came the moment I had anticipated all along, the resignation cascade. Executives unwilling to adapt or accept accountability chose to leave, rather than face their failings. LinkedIn profiles were updated hastily, sometimes dishonestly. Legal threats were issued, then withdrawn when confronted with irrefutable documentation of their behavior. The board, though initially nervous, grew confident in the stability of the new leadership. I had turned potential chaos into order. One morning, I received a particularly interesting email from Marjorie. The subject line read, "Reflection and Understanding." Inside, she admitted what she had never before considered, the skill, patience, and intelligence required for the positions she had once looked down upon. I forwarded it to Janet with a single note, "Document this. Potential for growth remains." Even Caleb and Nora began to show signs of genuine transformation. Caleb's team reported improvement in communication and collaboration, while Nora began to excel in her direct interactions with clients. What had started as a humiliating reassignment became a learning opportunity, a forced growth that they had previously avoided. The organization was not only stabilizing, it was thriving. 6 months into my tenure as CEO, Northstar Consolidated was unrecognizable. Employee satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. Innovation, collaboration, and morale had skyrocketed. The board called a special meeting to review the results. Their astonishment was barely contained as I presented the metrics, the before and after scenarios, and the evidence of cultural transformation. The media caught wind of the unusual story. The CEO who started as a cleaner and then restructured an entire executive floor based on direct observation. Interviews, articles, and business magazines featured the story, highlighting the unusual approach and the dramatic results. Photos of me standing confidently next to my cleaning cart, surrounded by a diverse group of empowered employees, became iconic. Despite the acclaim, I remained focused. The cleaning cart in the corner of my office was more than a prop, it was a symbol. It reminded everyone, myself included, that respect is earned through actions and integrity, not titles or appearances. Every day, I carried that lesson forward in board meetings, strategy sessions, and employee interactions. Occasionally, I would hear murmurs in the hallways. Whispers like, "She saw everything. She knows everything." This was the quiet acknowledgement that while I had been invisible, I had been observing, learning, and preparing. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was permanent. The ultimate triumph, however, was the internal transformation of the company culture. Employees who had once felt powerless now had a voice. Ideas were valued. Contributions recognized. Management understood accountability was no longer optional. North Star Consolidated was no longer a hierarchy built on fear and favoritism, it was a community built on respect, merit, and transparency. And in this environment, I found something unexpected, genuine satisfaction. Not in revenge, not in spectacle, but in seeing a system, flawed and unjust, become fair and functional. In watching those who had dismissed me adapt, change, and in some cases, grow, I realized that justice and progress could coexist. I took a final glance at the cleaning cart, now polished and symbolic, standing in the corner. It represented humility, observation, and preparation. It reminded me that sometimes, the path to leadership is through invisibility, patience, and understanding. The journey wasn't complete, culture shifts never are, but the foundation had been laid. North Star Consolidated was now a place where potential mattered more than pretense, where every voice could be heard, and where the power of quiet observation could change the world. The following week brought a different challenge, the human element. Numbers, charts, and policies could be changed quickly, but people, with their ingrained habits and personal biases, were far more complex. I decided it was time to test not just the company, but the loyalty, integrity, and resolve of those around me. It started subtly. I sent an anonymous note to one of the senior managers, Caleb Whitman, containing a fabricated scenario about misallocated funds. The message made it seem like an ethical dilemma, one where someone could benefit personally by bending rules. I wanted to see how he would react when confronted with temptation under pressure. Would he follow the lesson learned from his recent humbling or revert to old patterns? Caleb's reaction was measured. He brought the note to my office, eyes flickering between caution and curiosity. "I found this," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. I wasn't sure what to do. I smiled. "Good," I said. "You did exactly what I hoped." Integrity isn't always tested in the grand gestures. Sometimes, it's the small, quiet choices that define a leader. Meanwhile, Nora Beck, recently reassigned to client relations, faced a similar test. I had strategically placed a lost client file on her desk, suggesting an opportunity to embellish results and impress the board. Instead, she followed protocol, reporting the issue and correcting the mistake transparently. The subtle victories of ethical behavior began accumulating quietly, like sparks igniting a larger flame of trust throughout the company. The junior employees, those who had once been silenced by fear, began to emerge as unexpected leaders. One young analyst, Logan Peters, discovered a loophole in a reporting system that had been exploited for years by management to hide poor performance. Instead of using it for personal gain, he reported it, offering solutions that improved both transparency and efficiency. I observed these interactions from my office, quietly logging every detail. My cleaning cart, once a symbol of invisibility, now served as a reminder of how the smallest actions could lead to monumental change. Every choice mattered, and every test revealed the hidden character of those around me. At the same time, external pressures began to mount. Shareholders, initially skeptical about the unconventional leadership, were watching closely. Quarterly earnings reports would soon reflect the structural and cultural changes. Would the company perform financially under this new order, or would the disruption cost more than it saved? The board chairman, a quiet but astute man, called me into his office one afternoon. "Elena, we've been monitoring the market reaction," he said, his voice calm but intense. "The changes are bold. Some are worried, others impressed. But there's one thing everyone agrees on: you've shifted the culture permanently." I nodded. "That's the point. Culture drives performance, not the other way around." And he knew I was right. Data from internal surveys and performance metrics were already confirming what I had anticipated. Productivity had increased, employee engagement was up, and innovation, once stifled, was now flourishing. Departments previously considered stagnant were producing ideas that would have been dismissed under old management. But personal tests weren't just for employees. I had my own. The temptation to return to old patterns of micromanagement was subtle but persistent. Every day, I had to remind myself that real leadership meant guiding, not controlling, observing, not assuming, influencing, not dictating. Then came a test I hadn't foreseen, an emotional one. One evening, as I stayed late to review departmental restructuring proposals, I received a message from my estranged father, who had avoided involvement for years. He had heard about the changes and wanted to meet. I hesitated. Our history was complicated. He had once dismissed my potential, doubted my decisions, and contributed to the culture I was now unraveling. But the board insisted, personal reconciliation could be a powerful signal of transformation. I agreed to meet him at a neutral location the following afternoon. The conversation was tense. He attempted to downplay his past failings, presenting himself as supportive and eager to understand the changes I had implemented. I listened, asked probing questions, and remained composed. Every response was measured, every reaction noted. By the end of the meeting, it was clear, genuine change required accountability, not just from the executives, but from everyone connected to the company, including those who had once been passive observers. My father left with a newfound understanding, and I returned to the office with renewed focus. Back at North Star, the company continued to evolve. I introduced workshops on leadership, ethics, and transparency, ensuring that lessons weren't confined to policy manuals but integrated into daily practice. Employees began mentoring each other, fostering collaboration and trust. And then came the defining moment, a major client meeting with investors, scheduled to assess the success of the new leadership structure. I prepared meticulously, not just presenting data, but showcasing real-life examples of ethical decision-making, teamwork, and innovation. As the investors entered the boardroom, I glanced at my team. Every face reflected confidence, pride, and competence. This wasn't just a company that had survived change, it was thriving because of it. The presentation was flawless. Investors were visibly impressed, asking questions not about the novelty of my approach, but about the tangible results. When the meeting concluded, the board chairman gave a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that the transformation had been validated externally as well as internally. That night, I returned to my office. The cleaning cart, still in its corner, seemed to glow in the warm lamplight. It represented more than just observation, it symbolized resilience, patience, and the unseen work that forms the backbone of real leadership. And as I reflected on the journey so far, I realized a critical truth: true change doesn't happen from the top down or the bottom up. It happens through understanding, testing, and empowering every individual to rise to their best potential, even those who were once overlooked. Even with the company turning around, one loose thread remained: the executives who had openly resisted change. Their arrogance hadn't evaporated, and their resentment simmered beneath forced politeness. I had to address it directly, or risk undermining all the progress I'd fought so hard to create. I called an all-hands meeting, but not in the grand auditorium. This time, the setting was intimate, the old training room, where no one could hide in the crowd. Everyone from department heads to junior staff were present. The tension was palpable. Heads turned when I entered, not because of my presence alone, but because they knew this wasn't a casual gathering. "Thank you all for coming," I began, voice steady and calm. "Over the past few months, we've made tremendous progress. But there's one thing I need to clarify: change isn't optional. It's mandatory. And accountability isn't negotiable." Barbara Thompson, still smarting from her demotion, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. David Chen avoided eye contact entirely, while Sarah Williams' hands trembled as she clutched her notes. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of my words to settle in. "I know some of you believe your experience gives you immunity from accountability," I continued. It doesn't. Leadership isn't about longevity or connections. It's about integrity, empathy, and results. And we've been measuring both. Then, I began the demonstration, a live playback of selected security footage from the past 2 weeks. There it was, in high definition, clear as day: microaggressions, dismissed concerns, unethical directives. Each moment I highlighted carried a subtle lesson in contrast: how employees who acted ethically flourished, while those who relied on intimidation faltered. Barbara gasped audibly. How did you get that?" she stammered. "I observed," I replied evenly. "Just as you've observed your teams, I observed you. And just as you've been measured, you too are accountable." The impact was immediate. Several employees began taking notes, others whispered quietly, and for the first time, I saw genuine reflection on their faces. It wasn't fear anymore, it was understanding. But the reckoning wasn't complete. There was one final test, one designed to show that authority without empathy leads to failure. I gathered David Chen, Barbara Thompson, and Sarah Williams individually, presenting them with scenarios that mirrored their previous missteps. David's challenge involved making a high-stakes financial decision that would affect junior employees. Barbara's required mediating a sensitive HR dispute without bias. Sarah had to pitch a marketing plan with full transparency to a skeptical client panel. Each was monitored, coached, and evaluated, not to punish but to correct. Failures were immediate lessons, successes were recognized and amplified. By the end of the week, behavior had shifted significantly. The very executives who had resisted transformation were now acting as agents of change. Some grudgingly, others with surprising enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the company's metrics reflected the human progress. Productivity had increased by 28%, and employee retention rates hit a record high. But more importantly, culture surveys indicated genuine satisfaction, a stark contrast to the fear-driven environment that had existed before. The quiet employees now had voices, and the previously arrogant executives had learned humility. Then came the most personal challenge, reconciling with the people I had long struggled to forgive. Some former mentors and colleagues had doubted my methods, questioned my authority, and dismissed my approach. One by one, I scheduled private meetings, not to solicit apologies, but to demonstrate results. The conversations were difficult. Many were defensive, insisting that tradition was the only valid path. But as I walked them through measurable outcomes, changes in workflow, and improved employee morale, the walls gradually fell. Slowly, the resistance faded, replaced by curiosity and a tentative willingness to collaborate. I also reached out to former employees who had left in frustration. Invitations were extended to return, with assurances that their contributions would now be valued appropriately. To my surprise, many accepted, bringing back talent that had once been lost due to systemic failures. The culmination of these efforts arrived in a quarterly shareholder review. For months, skepticism had mounted in the boardroom. But this meeting would be different. With data, live demonstrations, and even a few testimonials from junior staff, I painted a complete picture. The company was not just financially stable, it was thriving because human potential was being nurtured at every level. Shareholders, previously cautious, now expressed visible approval. Questions shifted from doubt to curiosity, from criticism to strategy. Investors wanted to know how they could replicate this approach in other companies. By the end of the session, the board chairman leaned over and whispered, "You've done more than transform this company, you've set a new standard." And yet, I wasn't done. Real change demanded permanence, not temporary compliance. I worked with the HR department, now fully staffed with competent and trusted personnel, to rewrite policies, mandatory ethical training, anonymous whistleblower protections, transparent evaluation metrics, and a restructuring of leadership accountability. The final gesture came in the form of a ceremonial acknowledgement. I invited all employees to a gathering in the newly renovated communal workspace. Standing before them, I held the original cleaning cart, the symbol of my humble observation period. "This cart represents more than cleaning," I explained. "It represents seeing what others overlook, valuing every contribution, and recognizing the power of persistence, integrity, and humility. No role is too small, no effort insignificant. Our success is built on each of you." Applause erupted, not for me, but for the collective effort. Employees smiled at one another, some with tears in their eyes, realizing they were now part of something bigger than themselves, a culture where respect, accountability, and empowerment weren't just buzzwords, but daily practice. As the celebration ended, I knew that while the journey was far from over, the foundation was secure. The company wasn't just surviving, it was ready to lead, innovate, and inspire. And I, once the invisible observer, had become the guardian of its soul. Weeks passed, and the transformation I had ignited continued to ripple through global dynamics. It wasn't just policy changes or structural reforms, it was a profound shift in mindset. Employees who had once whispered in fear now spoke up confidently. Teams collaborated instead of competing destructively. And those who had underestimated the power of humility were learning that leadership was more than a title, it was responsibility. One morning, I walked through the office floor, dressed in my tailored suit, but carrying nothing more than my notebook. I observed small victories, a junior analyst mentoring a new hire, Barbara Thompson now calmly guiding a team with genuine empathy, and David Chen patiently explaining a workflow problem rather than dismissing it. Sarah Williams, surprisingly, had become an advocate for inclusive marketing, creating campaigns that reflected not just profits but principles. Each scene was a testament to what consistent accountability could achieve. Yet, I couldn't forget the hardest lesson: the family I had lost to greed and entitlement. The memory of my daughter Rebecca's suffering and the betrayal of my brother haunted me, even as I celebrated my professional victories. But I realized something vital: justice wasn't about revenge. Justice was about building a life where integrity mattered more than entitlement, where one's actions reflected their character. I decided to document everything. Every abusive executive encounter, every system failure, and every successful reform was meticulously archived. Not for punishment alone, but to ensure the company's story, its rise from dysfunction to integrity, could serve as a guide for future leaders. I called the project Foundations of Accountability. It would later become required reading for onboarding new executives and managers, a manual in corporate ethics and human-centered leadership. Meanwhile, I had one more personal victory to secure. Rebecca's surgery, the one we had fought for against my brother's theft, was scheduled. Watching her walk into the hospital with a confident stride, no limp, no pain, was more fulfilling than any boardroom triumph. The operation was successful, and for the first time in a decade, I felt the weight of fear lift. She had her life back, and with it, the proof that persistence, planning, and courage could overcome even the most calculated betrayal. Then came the day I finally severed the last lingering ties to my brother. The legal proceedings had concluded, federal agents confirmed his guilt in wire fraud and money laundering. He had been sentenced to 15 years, and the stolen money was restored. There was no celebration, no joy in seeing someone punished, but rather relief, a release from the anxiety that had shadowed every financial decision for years. I had no illusions about reconciliation. Some bridges, once burned, are better left in ashes. But I had reclaimed what was mine, and more importantly, what was Rebecca's. At Global Dynamics, the final piece fell into place with the establishment of a permanent ethics oversight board, which I chaired. Its mandate was simple: ensure that no single individual could wield unchecked power, and that respect and accountability remained central. My previous identity, the silent observer, the cleaning staff, was now a symbol of vigilance and integrity. Employees often asked why I had kept the cleaning cart in my office. I always replied, because it reminds me that no role is insignificant and no action is too small to matter. Months later, the company gained recognition for its revolutionary approach. Business magazines published feature stories: the CEO who started from the floor, from janitor to visionary, rebuilding corporate culture from the ground up. Interviews highlighted not just operational success, but the human story, how visibility, empathy, and courage could change an entire ecosystem. Personally, I learned something even more profound. Leadership wasn't about being feared or admired, it was about seeing, understanding, and acting. It was about stepping in when systems failed and guiding others toward fairness, dignity, and opportunity. And sometimes, it meant being invisible first, to truly understand what needed to change. At home, I watched Rebecca play in the yard, free from the pain that had once defined her life. My heart swelled with pride, not for what I had built at work, but for the life we had protected and nurtured together. Justice had been served, not through vengeance, but through strategy, patience, and unyielding moral clarity. I knew challenges would arise again. New executives, new crises, and inevitable conflicts. But the foundations were secure, and the legacy of accountability, empathy, and courage would endure. And as I looked out at the bustling office, the renovated workspace filled with empowered employees, I realized something that had taken years to understand: sometimes the most powerful change comes not from shouting or punishing, but from quietly observing, understanding, and then acting with unshakable resolve. In the end, silence wasn't lonely, it was strength. And in that strength, we found justice, freedom, and the power to reshape a world that had once seemed irrevocably broken. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.